The feedback that we received after the briefing was that looking at forecast performance was particularly valuable and to also provide help with planning. Earlier this week, the World Meteorological Organization released their Global Risk Report, which was about the state of the climate for 2023. And the oceans featured extremely prominently in this released report. A couple of schematics here of interest show how much of the global ocean was exposed to marine heat waves in 2023. Basically, 32% of the ocean was exposed to marine heat wave conditions on any single day in 2023. And that beats the previous average, where it was 23% in 2016. The opposite of heat waves are cold spells, and only 4% of the ocean was exposed to cold spells compared to the previous record of 7% in 2022. So a really dramatic year all around the world. The three subplots on the lower part of the graph just show you how over periods of time we've seen increase in both the coverage of marine heat waves in the ocean and also the category of those heat waves. And so particularly in the lower right, you can see that we're starting to see more severe and extreme heat waves in recent years compared to the 1980s, but a general uptick that's consistent with global warming. So that was 2023. How have we started off in 2024? 2023 was remarkable because the orange line, which showed temperatures for the part of the ocean between 60 north and 60 south, was higher than we'd ever seen before. And that was really striking at the end of 23. Look where we started in 2024. The black line here showing that already we're well above what was seen in 2023. And if that keeps going, we'll be in for another cooker of a year. So I think this is something that concerns us all. Pleasingly, the Australian policy environment around climate change, I think, is changing rapidly. And similarly, in the last week or so, two things have been released I think this group should pay attention to. The first was a first pass risk assessment called the National Climate Risk Assessment Project, and that provided some initial estimates of where risks were that would threaten things like food production, health, supply chains and transport and so on. And the oceans are featured in those reports. But the big game is going to be delivering this national adaptation plan. And at the moment, there's an issues paper out for review. And I think particularly climate risks in the ocean and extreme events in the ocean will have a lot of attention. And I'd ask our communities to stay very involved with discussions as we go to, on the next slide, Claire, the second phase of these national climate risk assessments. And this second phase will consider about 11 different sectors. Seafood is not getting its own sector. It's going to be wrapped up within the primary industries and food sector. And this project over the next 6 or 8 months will seek to provide national risk maps about things that give us a climate risk in the ocean. Marine heat waves is one of those. Sea surface temperature is another one. You might think chlorophyll distribution might also impact on seafood and so on. And so these will be delivered probably before the COP meeting in about November. Seafood's also linked to natural environments and supply chains, and these are two other sectors that will be covered in the second pass risk assessment. And I'm seeing that there are consultation groups being scheduled now for some of these sectors, but there's been nothing yet for seafood. So please keep your eye out for it. Thanks, Claire. That'll do me as a little overview of our current landscape.
Great. Thanks, Alistair. All right. So this is the usual, I guess, framework that we've used in the last few briefings. We'll go through recent ocean conditions around Australia and then step through the forecast for the next 3 or so months. So for current conditions, there are two maps on the left. The top one is for January 2024 and the one on the bottom is for February. So what I wanted to draw your attention to here is this dark orange colour is the highest ocean temperatures on record. So we're talking sea surface temperature, so, you know, top few centimetres of the water column. But you can see it was extremely warm in the Coral Sea in January. So this is since 1900 and also out into the Tasman. In contrast to that, on the west coast, we were either around average, what you would normally expect for a January, or even below average. So we don't get to see these colours very often on these maps. So, you know, at least one part of the Australian waters wasn't cooking. This sort of apricot colour is in the top 10%. So it's very much above average. So you can see a similar pattern for February. That warmest on record, sort of that dark orange stripe, is sort of absent in the February temperatures. But as you can see over on the right, if we take the average of all the sea surface temperatures sort of basically in that box around Australia, February 2024 was the warmest on record. That's backing up January as also the warmest January on record. So we've had 2 really hot months on average across the Australian waters. So that's important to keep in mind in terms of stress that's already been experienced over the summer in your part of the ocean, but also whether that's priming for more heat as we go through autumn and into winter. And we'll step through that as we get to the forecast information. We take a step back and look at the Pacific and Indian Ocean as well and how they interact with Australia. This is from the last week or so. So again, this is from satellite, so it's the top few centimetres of the water column. But you can see very warm conditions down in the Coral Sea, the GBR, these sort of pink colours, warmer than normal, and we're looking at temperatures that are 2 to 3 degrees warmer than you would expect in the middle of February. And given that this time of year is the warmest time of year already for for many parts of Australia, this is on top of what you'd normally see in summer temperatures. It is also very warm off northern New South Wales and extending further out towards Lord Howe and Norfolk. And it is also warm off the east coast of Tasmania. This image up here in the corner, you can see this is what I showed at our last briefing. So it might be a bit too small to see the text, but it was the last week of January. So you can see there's a lot less pink around the east coast of Australia, but there's still some areas that are still experiencing those high anomalies. We look at the marine heatwave tracker. So this is based on similar satellite information. This is from the 18th of March, so 3 or 4 days ago. And you can see moderate to strong heatwave conditions. So that yellow colour is moderate marine heatwave and the orange is strong in that same area. So southern GBR, Coral Sea, parts of New South Wales and extending further east towards Lord Howe and Norfolk. There's also some marine heatwave conditions observed down off sort of Victoria, Western Tasman Sea and around Tasmania. So that's just a daily snapshot. And if you're interested in seeing how that heat moves around, definitely take a look at this link here on the bottom. You can click through each day, but that pattern has been pretty consistent for the last few weeks. We then get into the water and we look at the bulk heat in the top 300 metres. For those who've been in these briefings before, you'll remember that there's no values on the shelf. So ignore anything that's very shallow inshore, that's white. But what we're looking at is if you've got heat in the subsurface, that is much more likely for marine heatwave conditions in those locations to hang around. If you only have a very shallow warm layer on top, you get a few windy days or a big storm, it will mix the water down into the water column and disperse the heat. However, if there's a good bank of heat sitting underneath the surface, it's much more difficult to disperse that heat with a few windy days. So you can see there's quite a lot of heat at depth. Again, same sort of area, southern Coral Sea, parts of the GBR, New South Wales, and also some heat off eastern Tasmania or in the Western Tasman Sea. So those areas that were lighting up in the previous plots at the surface, there's quite a lot of heat sitting underneath. Meanwhile, over in WA, it's pretty cool there. So there's not a lot of heat there at the surface at all, at the depth, at all. And we also saw that at the surface, in the surface signature too. So the focus is definitely southeast coast and extending offshore. Okay, so how did the recent forecast perform? So these were the 3 forecasts I showed in our last briefing. So we got across the top, we had the first half of Feb, second half of Feb, and then March. So if you look across the top, their forecast, the bottom is what was observed from satellite. So you can see we did a pretty good job for the first 2 fortnights. We captured that cooling on the west coast and up through the Northern Territory and got a pretty good, captured the heat off the east coast in the Coral Sea and off New South Wales and Victoria pretty well. You can see that in both these two, the bottom left and the bottom central images here. We also predicted the heat down off Tasmania as well. Stepping through to March, we don't have all of March in here, so we've only got 1st to the 18th. And so far, the model's done a reasonably good job of capturing the heat all the way down the east coast. And though we did over forecast at this point in the month what was happening sort of offshore in WA, so sort of far northwest, it hasn't been as warm as we indicated or we forecast, but the general patterns are pretty good. We then look at the marine heatwave forecast. So top two again, the forecast we had for February and forecast for March that we showed in the last briefing. And then below is what is observed. So February, we got all the areas that were predicted to have no marine heatwave conditions observed. That's what we've seen. We underestimated what was happening in the Coral Sea. So there was some indication that would be a moderate marine heatwave inshore, but it's actually extended further offshore than we initially predicted. And parts of New South Wales are actually higher than we had predicted as well. Some of this sort of spotty area in the Western Tasman, we've got parts of that. Other smaller features we haven't. But overall, we've done a reasonable job. If we look at March, again, we've only got sort of 2/3 of March in here. They're actually matching up pretty well. So even though the model didn't predict this heat in Tasmania or the full spatial extent, it has ramped up in February, showing that's the full Coral Sea that's in marine heatwave conditions. And to date, that's what we've seen in the observations. That the marine heatwave conditions that we predicted for the northwest hasn't eventuated, but that's reflecting those sea surface temperatures. We can also see strong marine heatwave conditions were predicted off the New South Wales coast, so offshore, and we've seen that eventuate as well so far, and also some in the eastern Tasman. Okay, if we look forward now through to June. So this is our global map. So this is April through to June. And in previous briefings, you would have seen a big sort of dark pink tongue of warm water, which is your typical El Nino signature in the Pacific. If you look here now, you can see the event is starting to break down, and I'll go through that in the next slide. This box here just shows the area in the Pacific, which is one of the indicators that the Bureau and other Met services look at when we're talking about whether we're in an El Nino or La Nina or neutral conditions. If we look around Australia, just on sort of over that 3 months, we're seeing that heat is predicted to hang around that same area. We just keep coming back to southern Queensland, northern New South Wales and offshore, and also some persistent heat in the eastern Tassie. Warmish on the west coast, not as warm as we're seeing on the east coast, but it's still predicting to be warm. We talk about El Nino specifically. So we're still in an El Nino state, but it's near its end. So neutral conditions, which are neither El Nino or La Nina, are expected to return later in autumn. So you can see here, this is the Bureau's forecast model that all of these forecasts are produced by. So you can be confident in that the temperatures you're seeing around Australia are influenced by the same information that we're seeing in these ENSO forecasts. So this is the observed information here, the Nino 3-4 index, which was that box in the Pacific. These grey lines here are all the model runs that we do, and then this green line is the average. So you can see the bulk of those are heading into this white central strip here, which is neutral conditions. If we look over on the right from the other international models, the Bureau surveys as well, we're the top bar. So we've got April at the top, May in the middle, June at the bottom. So you can see the grey bar for our model is backing off into this white strip. By the time we get to May, all the models are agreeing that will be in neutral conditions based on this indicator at least. By June, there are a couple of centres that are indicating La Nina conditions. However, this time of year, the models have particularly low skill trying to predict an ENSO event. So at the moment, the Bureau hasn't gone either way on saying La Nina or neutral for later in the year. So our advice would be to keep an eye on the climate driver update. The link will be at the end of the slides. But more importantly, to keep an eye on the sea surface temperature forecasts in your part of the world and your rainfall and air temperature, because they are updated every day. And that will give you a much better idea of what's going on in your region than just pinning it all on a single, is it a La Nina or an El Nino? Speaking of which, we'll step through to rainfall and to air temperature. So this is particularly relevant if you're working really inshore. So if you're in an estuarine system or you're inshore, there will be much greater influence of rainfall through freshwater inputs, as well as air temperature. So you can see drier than normal April to June season for most of the country. This one on the left is the chance of exceeding median rainfall for that season. So for Queensland and New South Wales, it's pretty much average season there. But for Northern Territory, WA and parts of the South Coast is likely to be drier. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the chance of it being in the driest 20%. So extremely dry. And definitely through Northern Territory, Kimberley's, Northern New South Wales and South Coast, there's a 1.5 to 2 times, it's 1.5 to 2 times more likely to be in that top 20% than it would normally be. So dry conditions for most coastal zones. And also, again, I feel like I show a red map for this every time I give this presentation. But this is for air temperature. So if you're inshore or really shallow waters, then the air temperature is going to play a bigger role in what's happening in the water column than if you're further offshore. On the left, chance of exceeding maximum temperature. So maximum just being your daytime temperature. Everywhere, high chance of exceeding median air temperature. On the right is showing top 20% daytime temperatures. So that area that we've seen lighting up on the sea surface temperature plots, southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, very high chance of being in the top 20% for air temperature and for a large amount of WA as well. Parts of Tassie, but I would say the two areas to take notice are these ones where we're seeing the sea surface temperatures and also Western Australia. Okay, getting into the water. So this is for the next two fortnights. So the rest of March, essentially, through to just after Easter, and then the first half of April. So pretty similar story in both fortnights. We can see a lot of cooling on, or cooler than normal conditions inshore in WA and on the northwest shelf, all the way around the coast and into southern Australia. However, the heat is the similar pattern on the east coast that we've been seeing the last few weeks. So Coral Sea, very warm. We're looking at temperatures up around 2 degrees warmer than normal. And also these areas here offshore from southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, and parts of the Western Tasman as well. And we can see that heat hanging around through to the mid-April. It does back off on the Coral Sea. I'm sure you're all aware of there's bleaching happening at the moment on the Great Barrier Reef. So, and that's driven by these warm temperatures. Looking at model skill, so always look at model skill, or sort of how well does the model do for this time of year in the area you're looking. So anywhere green, the model historically has done a good job. So we've got reasonable confidence in those forecasts for the next 2 fortnights for around the country. We then look forward through to the rest of autumn and into winter. So it is a fairly consistent pattern across the next 3 months. So I'd guess to summarise, you'd say cooler to average conditions on the northwest shelf, warm in the Coral Sea for the next 3 months, and very persistent heat. Heading east from southern Queensland, northern New South Wales. Those temperatures there are around 1.5 to 2 degrees, if not more, higher than you would normally see. So bearing in mind we are going into winter, so your absolute temperature will be lower because these are referenced to what you'd normally see in April, May and June, but it is still very warm. So there would need to be some thought around what processes and what ecosystems are doing in that time of year in those areas and what that extra heat in the system means. It is also very warm down in the Western Tasman here, not right inshore close to Tassie like we were seeing earlier in the summer, but it is still quite warm. We're up around 2.5 degrees warmer. So again, what does a warm winter mean for those systems in that area? And just for reference, this is what we were forecasting back at the start of February. So this forecast was produced at the end of January, and that's the one I showed in the last briefing. And you can see that at least for WA, I know the coral folks that look after this part of the Northwest Shelf are breathing a sigh of relief because that heat has really not eventuated and the forecast has really backed off for April. However, and well, I guess to some extent the Coral Sea, the forecast there has backed off a bit for April, but that heat, the other hotspots around here, we were predicting that back in January as well. Looking at how well the model predicts that, April, May and June, high for April, we've got good confidence in the forecasts around Australia. May and June are a bit spotty. Anywhere that's white, in the last 40 years, we haven't done a great job of predicting that area at this time of year. Typically that happens in eddy-rich areas, so New South Wales is always a bit problematic inshore where the EAC is active, East Australian Current is active, and there's a lot of eddies. It's hard for the model to get the eddies in exactly the right spot, so that's why you see these white patches. Okay, so now we're going to look at the extreme temperatures. So this is the top 10%, so that's our threshold for a marine heat wave. We look at all those model runs, so that those grey lines on our ENSO plots at each pixel on this map here, and we count up how many of those are in the top 10%. Anywhere that's this dark green colour is indicating 80 to 100% of the forecasts are in that top 10%. So it's the same areas again lighting up here. So offshore heading out to Norfolk from southern Queensland and northern New South Wales are showing a very high chance of marine heatwave conditions for the next 3 months. So that dark green area you can see on April, May and June. There is also high risk of marine heatwave conditions in the Coral Sea and across the Great Barrier Reef. So given that's on the back of what has already been a warm summer and that there's coral bleaching underway, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I know the Reef Authority has got a lot of surveys underway, but it looks like there will definitely be still warmer than usual going into winter, and then what that means for next summer. If we collapse that probability down and just look at on average, what's it say in terms of marine heatwave category? Same areas. So we've got moderate marine heatwave conditions in the Coral Sea and the Great Barrier Reef for the next 3 months. Moderate to strong to potentially severe offshore out to Norfolk Island and potentially beyond that, and also in the Western Tasman. Everywhere else around Australia is fairly clear in terms of predicted conditions. I mean, that can change, so we'd keep an eye on the forecast, but it's the same areas, so basically down the east coast and offshore that are indicated at risk for the next 3 months. Okay. Over back to Alistair.
So when we present this information, we're also trying to provide you with some guidance about what stage you're at and what preparations or responses might look like. And so in Southeast Australia, we've been through when we began the briefings in June that we were predicting events on the basis of El Nino driver, forecasting them with these products by August, September. And then the December, February period has really seen them emerge. And so we've been in this step 3 where we've been responding to events. I'm game enough to call March now the recovery phase for Tasmania and Victorian areas. It's lasting slightly longer than we'd forecast in New South Wales, and so maybe New South Wales, you're still during events. In Queensland and Northern Australia, we had predicted that you'd be experiencing these events now during March. That's borne out for Queensland, but as you see, Northern Australia and the Gulf of Carpentaria was cooler than we had forecast. So I'd say that you're already through to a recovery stage or a non-event in those regions. But I think that you won't see recovery in Queensland for a few more months yet, April and beyond. So then we enter the season called winter. Absolute temperatures are cooler, but it's still going to be a relatively warm winter. And so think about the animals that we farm, fish, or observe, that they will still be experiencing cumulative stress. What does that mean in the ocean? That you've just continued to be hotter than average for a very long period of time now. And so that accumulated stress is already playing out on coral reefs down the east coast of Australia, where the temperatures didn't get super high. You know, these weren't massive heat waves. They've just been persistently above average. I think that's generally meant we haven't seen lethal effects. So reproduction and growth may be being impacted on the east coast, perhaps catchability for some species, if you've noticed that animals are not going into traps or catchability's changed. So while we're in phase 4, which we'd typically say you'd be recovering, we're just worried about this seasonal stress will still be high. And so this phrasing of winter warmth, you know, animals living in this part of the world typically are adapted to a cooler winter, and there may be different body condition they put on. Gonad maturity may be important during winter. And so I think it's just a really big unknown. What do we do as we start seeing these warmer and warmer winters? So the kinds of things that if you're in phase 3 or phase 4 now, people who are still experiencing marine heatwave conditions are still having to adapt their operations. For example, running cooler water through holding facilities for animals, making sure that they're in good condition before they're shipped if they're live shipment or so on. Conservation practitioners are still holding animals in captivity. And one example we know about in southern Tasmania, and I don't know what else might be going on around the country, but you're still basically in that protection phase at the moment. Once we get through to the recovery phase, and despite it being a warm winter, I hope that we'll still be able to do some of the look back and evaluate how well your preparations helped this year. If we've seen reduction in mortalities, that would be a great outcome. And particularly phase 4 is a chance to assess your long-term planning and be ready, can I say it, ready for next summer. So I think I've covered this one enough, actually, Claire. They were documented in the previous slide and just saying, so there are different things you can do. But again, our focus here is on the east coast there, where while the event was happening. Click through to phase 4 though. And again, that's why I say for Tasmania at the moment, I think you're kind of in the clear at the moment on the basis of our current observations. And so now's the time to assess the event using data that you've collected over the last few months, and really start thinking about that long-term management planning. Examples of what have been shared with us by our colleagues on the call are marine heatwave response plans. And both Tasmania and New South Wales have been leading in this effort at the moment. And so in both these plans, they really emphasise the importance of an early warning system. Forecasts that Claire and I provide, you know, are reliable at some times a year in some places, but you've seen where the forecasts didn't do so well, for example, in the Gulf of Carpentaria this year. And so this idea of having in situ observations that you can do your own early warning system is a really good backup to a forecast. Geez, it shouldn't even be a backup. It should be done in parallel to forecasting. Both plans have talked about incident responses and the management actions that can be put in place, and the communication that we need to do both with our political leaders, but also stakeholders around what you might do in response to extreme events. And so here's New South Wales had a 4-step plan. Tasmania, led by Francis Seaborn, has got a 6-step plan, where again you see early warning systems, emergency responses and communication as being front and centre. And a range of products have been developed in both New South Wales and Tasmania that I hope the rest of the country can draw on and use to develop their own specific responses in future. And I know both Mel Coleman from New South Wales and Francis from Tasmania are really open to learning from other jurisdictions and sharing what they've done in their states. Thanks to both of them, Claire, for sharing those slides with us. So as we get to the end of the summer, the most dramatic impacts have been the bleaching. And I've got to say, some of the pictures that my colleagues who've been out on the barrier reef over the last 2 weeks are just, you know, tears in your eyes kind of pictures at the moment. We've just seen this really strong bleaching, North and South Barrier Reef, Norfolk Island, Lord Howe Island. And if that warming continues, those bleached corals may become dead corals. If we get enough wind mixing, and maybe the injection of cooler water, maybe the bleached coral recovers. As far as we know, there haven't been recent mortalities in wild fish. So that's been, as far as I know, is good news. So that the heating hasn't been strong enough to cause mortality of things like abalone as has been observed in previous years. So what then that we've learnt in the preparation for this summer sets us up for next summer? For example, in Western Australia next year, you might be starting to think about, if we do go into a La Nina year, which is forecast by some, and if it's a positive Indian Ocean dipole during the summer, we might expect temperatures that are like the upper right-hand sea surface temperature plot. That's the average conditions experienced when we've seen La Nina and positive IOD in that region. That's quite strong warming. If the IOD is neutral, coming down to the middle picture, we'll still see warming in northern Western Australia, but maybe the south's a bit cooler. And if it's a negative IOD in a La Nina condition, this is what we might see. So I would start to think about using the analog forecasts and your historical experience just to prepare for the range of things that you might experience next summer, if not Western Australia, other places in the country. And improving for next summer, it's the time now to have a look at, are there other things you can do to manipulate your fishing, conservation, aquaculture system to give you more opportunity for responding to heat waves in future? If we've got 6 months till temperatures really rise again, what might you want to change in the regulatory environment that has restricted your ability to respond to climate extremes or impacts? Hopefully we've improved the leadership and influence in this space, and there'll be lots of people really keen to improve their industry responses in future. And I guess I just point out the 7th one. Have a look back at the data that you've collected, and that will really tell you where the water was warmest in particular areas, where impacts have been observed, and keep looking out for these sublethal responses over the winter. If we have a very poor growth in some species over winter or poor gonad maturation, we might have low recruitment in some species next summer. We're sharing this kind of information not only with this briefing, but in follow-up discussions with a group of us around Australia that are providing additional information. And again, the FRDC Extension Network, I hope, is becoming a first point of contact for gaining additional information that people on the ground need to have. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Alistair. And so that wraps up the briefing for today.